Hey, it's Justin Harvey. Thanks for tuning into the Anesthesia and Pain Management Success podcast. With APM Success, we take a close look at important topics pertaining to business, practice management, personal finance, and careers for anesthesiologists and pain management physicians. We work hard to take your critical questions straight to the experts. Thanks for listening. Hello, and welcome to another episode of APM Success. Very pleased to be joined today by Michael White of Founders Advisors. I came across Michael and his colleague Thomas Dixon and some others somewhat recently, and I found that we have some philosophical alignment in the way that we try to help physicians understand their businesses and, as part of their financial journey, understand what they need to do in their businesses to change it, to make it more saleable, and what is the role of a business liquidity event, a practice liquidity event in the sort of financial journey of a physician. So very pleased to have Michael here today. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Hey, thank you, Justin. I really appreciate you having me today. It's a pleasure to be here.
So for starters, why don't you give us a sense of your journey and what brings us here today?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So I am Michael White. I'm the managing director at Founders Advisors. We're based in Birmingham, Alabama, but we have an office in Dallas and one in Nashville as well. And we provide financial advisory services to business owners. As the name says, primarily founders, owners, operators, entrepreneurs in their search for either an investment partner or an exit. And that can take the flavor of an exit in whole or an exit in part. Many times it is into private equity. And we can talk a little bit more about really what is private equity as we get into the conversation, if you would like. But I cover healthcare. I've been a healthcare finance guy my entire career. I've covered pretty much everything there is to cover within healthcare. I worked in New York at Bear Stearns through the financial crisis in 2008, covering healthcare primarily on the large pharma and pharma services outsourcing side back then. I shifted to Barclays Capital and moved to the West Coast and spent about another 9 years on the West Coast, living in the San Francisco area, covering healthcare from Seattle to San Diego, up and down that corridor. And then following a stint as a chief financial officer of a specialty pharmaceutical company, I wanted to move back closer to home. And so I joined the team at Founders Advisors 7 years ago and have been leading the healthcare effort here. Healthcare is a big word. It means something different to everybody you talk to. Sometimes it's a pleasant word and sometimes it's not, depending on what end of the healthcare spectrum you're on. When we think about healthcare here at my firm, look, 50% of what we do is advising physicians across different specialties in their search for a partner. I would say another quarter of what we do is kind of healthcare information technology, particularly if it's a service or a tech-enabled product into a physician office or an alternate site of care. So things like revenue cycle or EHRs or practice management systems. We've advised a fair number of those. And then the other bucket is really where life sciences and services intersect. And so I said I spent a lot of time on the pharma side historically. This is really contract research, pharmaceutical outsourcing. So not advising the companies that are developing the drugs, but companies that provide services or products into those companies. I know today we're really going to talk about physicians, and this is one of the areas, like I said, that we've done the most work in over the last 7 years across multiple different specialties. And I think we've learned a lot along the way about what makes a great physician practice, and how to help position a practice throughout the course of our relationship for a better outcome when that time comes.
It's so interesting to me how vast the healthcare ecosystem is and all the different participants. And even in hearing you describe your journey, my mind is continuing to be expanded. as to all those participants. Why don't you, for starters, and I gave you minimal prep, so I'm going to put you on the spot here and say, why don't you
Okay.
give us the good, the bad, and the ugly of something in quasi recent history for you in terms of deals you've evaluated or prospective clients that you have talked to and things that characterize their practice and that practice's journey and sort of what you found or concluded or observed about those.
Yeah, so we recently closed a transaction in the urgent care space. This was a really successful transaction, one that produced a great outcome for my client. And I think they are positioned with a private equity partner who is going to be one of the winners in the space as they move forward. This was effectively the second acquisition by the private equity group. So they made a platform acquisition, bought a group of urgent care centers in an adjacent geography, a state that was adjacent to where this one is located. And once they've established a base of operations, they like to be able to build out and create geographical density where you can leverage some of the things that I know are really challenging for physicians, particularly in smaller size practices. And what I mean by that is a lot of time, the chief physician is also the chief executive, the chief financial officer, the chief marketing officer. And oh yeah, he's still trying to provide great high quality patient care and make a difference in his patients' lives. That's one of the things really where private equity can offer something to physicians that's very appealing outside of dollars. It allows a physician to take off a few of those hats, concentrate on what they went to medical school to do, de-risk some of their personal financial wealth by taking potentially some money off the table in the first transaction, and be in line for multiple transactions in the future to help continue to monetize some of the equity that they've built in that practice. One of the things that I thought worked really well here was it was a group of physicians who had really built their practice on the back of providing high quality patient care. In urgent care, there's a dynamic where patient visits are driven sometimes by convenience, right? If you're sick and you urgently need to see a physician and you can't get into your primary care physician, you may just go to the nearest urgent care. But they had a 20-year history and documented cases of repeat customer visits, repeat patient visits. And that was really appealing because you knew whether it was a big flu season or not, there was still a baseline level of patients here. There are different puts and takes within different specialties, but I think one of the things that really drives a lot of value and a lot of interest is going to be really what is your reputation for quality care among your patients? That's probably one of the key pieces that is going to make a practice, for lack of a better word, more marketable when the time comes to look for a partner.
I'm sure that you probably see physicians, as you described the many hats that a practice owner, even if there's a group of owners, because they come up through the clinical ecosystem, not usually through like, I got an MBA and then I went back to med school. There's often one of the sort of blind spots is the business, the marketing, the even like the brand, so you mentioned quality care is an important, it's table stakes essentially.
Yes.
Whenever you see practices that are doing well in that area where they seem to have a good reputation among the people that know them, but they lack the sort of the whatever the turbocharging component is to sort of get that message and that brand out to the masses. Can you talk a little bit about how you might help a practice that's in that circumstance?
So, look, what my business is transactional in nature, right? The way we're compensated is on the successful close of a transaction. But I think my firm, and particularly myself and the healthcare team here, take a relational approach to it. And so what that means is if we've met someone as a physician practice or a different company in one of the other sectors I talked about, like healthcare IT. We like to establish a relationship, begin working with that owner or provider to build a plan for an exit. When you asked about the good, the bad, and the ugly, one of the things I think that is tough is if someone is at the end of their rope and throwing up their hands, and they want to have sold their practice yesterday or last year, and that makes it tough because there's a different set of concerns that you're trying to address at that point. But if you start and you begin with the end in mind, you can institute some of the things that I think outside of the brand and the high quality patient care, you can institute some of these things that will make you differentiated when the time comes. And look, it's a little bit of a circular reference because I understand exactly how many demands on a physician's time they have. But one of the biggest differentiators in terms of value is having and understanding the data that relates to your financial performance, your patient visits, any seasonality in the business, and being able to touch on those key performance indicators or KPIs and have them at hand. That's going to make a big difference at the end of the day when it comes to value. Value is it's a function of risk. Things that are riskier are less valuable. One of the biggest contributors to valuation across industries, across practices, across whatever, is sheer size, because 10 is further away from 0 than 2. Something that has 10 is going to be less risky because you have an ability to weather some sort of up and down within that business. And being able to point to that and show that you understand the business is going to allow the investor or the owner to place a higher valuation on it because they're more certain of the historical cash flows, of the future cash flows, and that results in a higher valuation multiple at the end of the day.
Talk about the life cycle of a deal. And when somebody first, you said the long game and like trying to build relationships, and this is totally my love language here. The long game is the only game, is the saying we have around here at APM Wealth. And
that's a great saying.
With with these kinds of relationships, trust is so important. And there's a lot of dollars, being tossed around. And if you're going to earn a big chunk of your business is transactional, so you're paid a commission, you're incentivized to get the best deal that you can for your client. But whenever there's a lot of dollars at stake, there's a lot of moral hazard. And so having that relational longevity is an important part of this. So talk about like the first time you shake somebody's hand, when they usually sign up, what you're doing for them, and what is their journey as a client of yours.
So look, in all likelihood, the absolute fastest you could go from meeting someone to closing a transaction is probably about 6 months. I would say that time has lengthened a little bit over the last couple of years as interest rates have increased and the cost of capital has increased. People, investors, buyers are being more diligent because there's a higher cost to what they're investing, and it impacts the return model that they're using to make their investment decisions. So I would say I'm at the tail end of a transaction these days. Hopefully that's me knocking on wood. It closes in the first 2 weeks of August. And so we're at the tail end. This is a physician practice. I met the team at this practice almost 2 years ago. And, I got to know them. We visited together. I asked about their goals, talked about what they wanted to accomplish, talked about the timeline, and said, here is where I think your valuation would be. And this is 2 years ago when I first met him. Here's where I think your valuation would be today. Here's where I think you would be if you were to take the next 12 months and work on these three things. And it ended up being maybe four things, but we launched that process. I want to say at the very beginning of December. So we're now 7 months into it, 8 months into it. That's a pretty typical time frame from when we decide, okay, we've done these things. The market is very receptive right now. We feel like we've hit the sweet spot, the inflection point, and there are still some things that we could do, but the return on the value from instituting some of those internal initiatives was declining. And so we made the decision to go to market at the beginning of December. We launched it. Usually speaking, there's about from launch until you're under an LOI with one particular group, that's a letter of intent. That means that you've talked to everybody, you've been on speed dating, you've deleted your dating app, and now you want to get exclusive with this one party. And so you've signed a letter of intent on the value, and you're then what we call in diligence. And so we've been in diligence with this party exclusively now for about 3 months. And it's probably a completely different conversation that we could have, or I could have with anyone who's curious down the line as to what comes in each of the various stages. But it's incumbent upon us to try and minimize, as your advisor, minimize the amount of time in diligence, because once you're exclusive, you've lost some of the leverage that you have from being able to, well, I like this about this group and this about this group. Is there any way we can get, both of those in one group? And so we try and minimize the amount of time in diligence and get to the finish line as quickly as possible. But roughly speaking, it's sort of 3 to 4 months before you're exclusive, 3 to 4 months before once you're in diligence before you're closed.
And anywhere from like 3 months to 5 years on the front end of that to optimize and prepare for this process.
That's right.
Yeah. So tell me about you mentioned this MBA buzzword, KPIs. I love KPIs and talking about them and identifying the highest yield KPIs. Whenever you're walking into a practice or building this relationship with practice owners, and you're looking at here's the 10 data points or whatever it is that tells you how healthy is this practice, how much momentum is there, how much growth is there. What are the handful of KPIs that for you stand out that you might want to direct a physician's attention to say, here's the numbers you need to manage in order to get the kind of sale value that you want?
Yeah, look, growth is very important. So where you were over the last 12 months, where you expect to be over the next 12 months. Some practices, some areas within medicine are more predictable than others. Others have a little bit of seasonality to them. With urgent care, if there's a big flu season or a big RSV season, or potentially there's an outbreak of COVID, that can cause a spike in numbers. And so really having an idea of your historical growth and where your projected growth is probably number one. A lot of that is not just driven. A lot of it is driven by volume, but some of it is driven by your relationship with payers and how your rates may differ between a different set of payers. That's a piece of it. I think if there is, if it's a business like dermatology or a practice like dermatology where there's potentially a general derm component, there's potentially a cosmetic component, there's potentially a surgical component, understanding the difference between that. And then I think understanding the provider relationships. And so it could be the owning physicians, their associate physicians, whether or not they are equity owners, their tenure, how their employment agreements look. Are they happy? Are you looking for someone on the physician side to replace someone who potentially has left? Do you have a model that is this a practice where you can utilize extenders extensively, right? Can you use a PA or a nurse practitioner? All of those things are questions that I would want to understand, not just the overall snapshot of there's this much in revenue and this much in profitability. You want to understand how it's looked over a reasonable historical period and how you expect it to look going forward.
Can you think of any circumstances where you had a big win in terms of, all right, guys, like I understand you want to sell this thing. We're going to have to right the ship. Your XYZ KPI is moving in the wrong direction. Your volume is way down. Your reimbursement is getting crushed. We got to like stop the bleeding here. And you were able to suggest some changes that a practice was able to implement?
So yes, there are a couple that come to mind. One was a process that we had launched at the tail end of 2019. We had received letters of intent from 10 really interested parties. The date we received those letters of intent was March 6th of 2020. And so on March 7th or 8th or 9th, I called everybody back and said, we really like this, but your value's too low. We need you to sharpen your pencil. We need you to do this on the terms. Well, that was the 9th. And then on March 12th, the world took a giant pause. And so our process went on pause because we didn't know how things were going to go. And the interest, like I said, was pretty high at the tail end of, or the beginning of 2020. We talked about during the time we tried to re-engage in the summer of 2020. And this was a practice where there wasn't a first degree impact from COVID, but there was a second degree impact. And it was one of the related to it was related to an essential healthcare service. But what we ultimately decided to do was kind of pause, hire an extra physician, hire a couple of extra extenders, because we felt like once things opened back up, after having had the benefit of talking with everybody and assessing where we were, there was going to be a bolus of demand that came through. And that is exactly what happened. And so our value at the end of the day was probably 40% higher than it would have been if we hadn't had the pause that came with COVID then. And those gentlemen, it was 3 primary equity owning physicians in this practice group, found, I think, a better partner, a better fit for them the second time around. The party was in the process at the beginning, but they really identified with the strategy that we had on hiring an extra physician and a couple of extra set of hands from the extender side. And so that was a really big win based on instituting, a growth plan. We've had another win a little bit more recently where we talked about, look, on the cost side, I think you've got some things that are just not really in line. And this was in a big MSA, a big metropolitan area, probably top 9 or 10 cities in the United States. Well, there's wage pressure, there's cost pressures, and that's true. And so, but we kind of talked about some of the things that had been happening at really the MA level, and instituted, after kind of thinking about it, one of the pieces of the puzzle that was missing for this practice was they were having to retrain MAs on an ongoing basis. And so they instituted a couple of things to keep that part of the workforce happier. They spent less on recruiting. They were spending less on training. The workforce was more impactful. Everyone in the practice was happier, from the owners all the way down to the MAs, because it wasn't a different face every day. And everybody, so that was, and again, we just talked about it. I didn't do anything to institute this plan, but again, you could see after sort of 6 months, the margin improving, and it has continued to improve. And that is a great tailwind to have when you're launching a process and you're going out and talking to investors, because that's the type of thing, that's the type of anecdote that hits home and resonates with a group of private equity investors. So those are two off the top of my head, I think, that are pretty good.
That last one, Michael, that you mentioned, I think it's very interesting to me, because what you're describing is essentially like a culture shift that raises morale, that increases retention. Turnover is one of those things. It's a killer. And it's kind of there's not an explicit financial cost oftentimes, but it's like I just hired a new person and they're going to be 25% as productive for the next 2 months until they figure out what the heck they're doing. There's this sort of like, it's a hidden cost frequently, but you certainly see it in terms of the profitability, because your throughput is down, patient satisfaction is down. These other like qualitative things are moving in the wrong direction. So a practice that's able to do something as fundamental as improve culture through a series of strategic initiatives, it's probably like 6 different things you got to push on. Some of them are financially related. Some of them are more relational. That's kind of the holy grail.
It is. Look, and there's a slide I use a lot of times where we have the quantitative aspects of valuation and some of the qualitative aspects of valuation, because look, there is definitely a science to valuation, but there's also an art. And look, sometimes you can't put your finger on exactly what it was that made Group A bid 15% higher than Group B, but sometimes you can, and a lot of it is relational. And once you've had an opportunity to finding the right partner, I think particularly in physician services, in this area of healthcare that I cover, it's really important. And I say it's really important because you are going to be partners, at least for a period of time. Occasionally, there's a transaction where you sell 100% of your equity and you walk up right off into the sunset and you retire as soon as it closes. That's not often how it works. Most of the time, It's a majority recapitalization where you're going to sell 70%, roughly, call it 60 to 80% of your equity, you're going to sell to the private equity investor, and you're going to retain a bit of ownership. So it's 20 to 40% ownership you're going to retain in the new company going forward, or the company that you're joining. And it's done that way to align incentives. And it aligns the incentives because you both are owners now, but it means that you want to be deliberate about who you partner with, because sometimes at the end of the day, it may not be worth an extra dollar to have to be miserable. Sometimes it is, but it's important. And look, there are various flavors of private equity investors out there, and learning about them, just kind of getting back to what's important about culture. You want to, as part of this process, you want to interview your investors to make sure that these are the kind of people that I can have dinner with, that I would enjoy, spending. Maybe nobody's going to enjoy spending 4 hours in a boardroom once a month, but you don't want to be miserable having to do business with these people at the cost of, or at the price or benefit of an extra dollar. And so that's important to think about along the pathway.
I think that is a great point. And in closing, I want to ask a specific question in this vein. If I'm a physician and I'm going to put on I'm a hyperbolic doctor who looks at the people who know things about the money, the private equity, and the investment bankers, and I think they are everything that's wrong with healthcare. And the thought of having to hire one of these people, work with one of these people to sell my practice that I've been putting my blood, sweat, and tears into for the last 9 years it's akin to like being cornered in the back of that, used car sales lot and like, oh my gosh, I'm going to feel dirty about this no matter what. And so there's often this apprehension even at the outset. So can you help to slightly demystify, and what are a handful of questions, important due diligence questions or relationships or mechanisms to understand should a doctor be forearmed with before they go into this process?
Yeah. So look, I won't say the relationship, the reputation of private equity or private investment in healthcare is unwarranted. I think what I will say is I think there are probably a few cases or a few instances of bad actors ruining the reputation of the majority of the participants in the sector. I will say I've run across my share of jerks in private equity, just like I've run across my share of jerks at the DMV or at the Chick-fil-A, right? Like not every Chick-fil-A is the best Chick-fil-A in the world.
My profession suffers from the same problem, by the way. So I hope you understand that I'm just making up.
There are bad actors everywhere.
That's right.
And again, I think there are enough of them that I think a physician would be comfortable that he could find someone that he could see eye to eye with. I think that's important to say. So what I would say is, what do you want to know on the front end? Well, when we help design a process, we do a lot of the vetting of the private equity groups on the front end for our clients. But one of the key things we like to do is when we are before we sign an LOI, we'll bring groups in to meet with the owners, and we'll do what we call management meetings. And look, a management meeting at its core is we sit in a conference room and we spend 4 hours together talking about the business, and we meet. But the night before, we like to have dinner. We have a dinner offsite in a private room where everybody can break bread together and get to know each other in a little bit of a more informal fashion, and start building the relationship that way. And I think getting people outside of a conference room and somewhere where there's less where there's where there's an ability to have an easier conversation, right? It's tough sometimes to break away from formalities when you're stuck in a conference room. So that's piece number one. Number two, I think you want to understand when it gets to the business tactics or the business side of it is what is their plan going forward for how they are going to help you be better than you were independently. And there are a number of questions to get, but that's the heart of what you want to understand. And if they don't have an answer to that, then that's probably not someone you want to continue the conversation with. If they're just, well, we're gonna give you this much money and but if they don't have a plan that they can relate to you and help, and you believe that you're going to be better off professionally, financially, personally, then that's it. Some of the more just nuts and bolts questions relate to things like, what's your expected hold period? How long will I have to wait until there's a potential for me to monetize the 20 to 40% of equity that I rolled into this transaction? Do you have a thought around that? What does the reporting structure look like? Am I going to be reporting to you who's here at the dinner? And what I mean by reporting, like who's going to be helping on finance? Who's going to be helping on marketing? Who's going to be helping on other patient initiatives? Because the good private equity firms have somebody in charge for all of that, and they may not be at the dinner, but you're going to want to have an opportunity to talk with them and make sure that those are also people that you like and are comfortable with. That's probably the number one and two, I would say, is, but make sure they have a plan and you believe it, and then talk to them about that plan and who you're going to be not reporting to. That's the wrong. Who you're going to be working with on the other aspects of this transaction on a go forward basis. How are they going to help you succeed?
Can you help us understand sort of where you and your firm and your services fit into the deal, and who are the parties that are involved and who interfaces with who?
Yeah. So we sit on the side of the physician as their trusted financial advisor. We will help build out a set of marketing materials and design a targeted group of investors that we will go out to when we launch the transaction. And for the first month, once we're out in the market and having these conversations, we will work to really have all of those conversations and let the physician group concentrate on seeing patients and not spending time wearing the investment banking hat on top of the CEO hat and the CFO hat. Because one of the most important things once you decided to go forward here is to make sure that you're not taking your eye off the ball as far as it goes financially, because that's something that's going to result in problems downstream. If August of 2024 is worse than August of 2023 by 100%, that's going to be a problem. So we will do that. You would have on your side, you would have as the physician, you would have your accountant who's probably interfacing with us, and you would have a lawyer or a legal team who is interfacing with us as we are strategizing around indications of interest and letters of intent, and helping on the legal diligence side. On the other side, they're going to have the same set of counterparties. The private equity group may or may not have an investment banking advisor. They would have a legal advisor. These third-party advisors on the accounting side, they're going to bring in somebody to verify that the financials are correct. They're going to bring in a third-party advisor to do a review of coding to make sure that there's no fraud, that there's no history of overcoding. They're going to do a review of that down the line, but that's once you're exclusive. Mm-hmm. But where we sit as, call it the quarterback, to help make sure all of the plays are running and they're running on time, and to make sure that you as an owner, physician, have an opportunity at the appropriate time to meet and talk with everyone. Will help you get prepared with, I gave a couple of examples of questions. We'll help you get prepared ahead of the dinner or the management meeting with all of the right questions to ask, how to ask them, and we'll facilitate that as well.
How much should a physician expect to pay for the services you described?
So our model is built on a success fee basis. Look, if for the example I gave where I met a practice and I worked with them for a year before we launched, and we launched in December, for all of the advisory work that we did ahead of launch, we don't charge anything. Once we launch a process, once we've committed to our resources to helping build out the materials and go to market, there's a retainer that we charge on a monthly basis, but it's credited back against the success fee. The success fee is designed to be a percent of the expected enterprise value up to where we think the valuation is, and then a slightly larger percent on incremental value above that, so that you as the owner feel like our incentives are aligned to get you the best and highest value possible. We concentrate on three things: headline enterprise value or headline value, best, highest value possible, the right set of terms as it relates to employment agreements, which are particularly important among physicians, and then really the probability of getting from start to finish. Those are the areas where we, outside of headline enterprise value, probability of close and terms in particular, as it relates to employment agreement, we would work with your attorneys to make sure that those are palatable, and because that is key to the exchange of value in selling a part of your practice, is getting comfortable that you're going to be there on day 1, day 365, and 4 years from then.
If some listeners want to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to do that?
They're welcome to email me. They can email me at mwhite@foundersib.com, or they could give me a call. You could give me a call on
we'll just do the email address, Michael,
okay,
and I can throw anything else in the show notes. So for our listeners, check out the show notes if you want to get a hold of Michael, or shoot him an email. Michael White, this has been really elucidating for me. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us. I would love to have you back to zoom in on different parts of this process. This is really important
to do it.
This is really important for doctors to understand, as you know, and I do too. And
look,
some
I've
doctors,
been a healthcare finance guy my entire career. I love to talk about this, whether it's with you or anyone else. Shoot me an email. I'd be happy to set up a one-on-one time to talk with anybody. And if you're open to it, please invite me back in the future, and we can double click or dig down into any of the other topics we didn't have a chance to cover today. Thank you, Justin.
Thanks, Michael. If you liked what you heard this week, head on over to apmsuccess.com, where you can find more content and free resources to help you build a successful career in anesthesia and pain management. If you wanted to leave a review in iTunes, I'd also really appreciate it. Thanks for using some of your valuable time to join me today on APM Success.